Today, I'm with my good friend John Browett, who's been a leading global retailer for more than 15 years. His career really is a who's who of global retail. Having started as the chief executive of Tesco.com, he moved to the chief executive of Dixons International, owner of PC World and Currys, spent a time on the executive board of Apple, chief executive of Monsoon Accessorize, and currently he's the chief executive of Dunelm, the UK's leading homeware retailer. Hello, John.
Hi.
So, over the years that we've been talking to each other, you've had an incredible career. What have been some of the lessons that you've learned about the importance of what you pay attention to?
I think the journey really started with this appreciation that, of course, you've got to have a good plan. But the real development over time was actually the effectiveness of getting that plan through the way you led as a person, which meant you had to be right in yourself. And then also how you actually got the culture of the business to work, particularly around the relationships of the senior team.
So when did you first start to kind of really get a sense of, oh my goodness, there's three things here, not just doing stuff?
Yeah, well, I suppose it came over time. I mean, of course, you were coaching me, I think, early on in my career and explained that to me, but it took several years for me to really understand what it meant. I think the bit which was a shock to me when I started leading a business was how much attention you had to pay to yourself and how you came across, because the danger is, especially when you're younger, is you actually take an egocentric view of it and you start telling everybody what to do, which of course in the short run is highly effective and it makes you feel like you're doing things, but it causes a lot of trouble, because if people are not really bought in, then there are loads of ways in which both your direct reports and the organisation can sort of unpick what you're trying to do.
And would you say you've changed a lot of it as a human being over the years, going through all these different experiences?
Yeah, massively. What was very interesting was listening to the feedback, you started to realise that actually great leadership comes from within, and actually how in control you are of your own ego, etc. And then I started reading a lot about that stuff, and in fact you introduced me to the Ken Wilber stuff early on, which I have to say was very complicated and difficult to read, but it really got me out of a sort of that egocentric view of your own leadership, and actually put me into very much the sort of servant leader perspective, of Jim Collins, etc. And that was a really for me, it's a formative moment actually in the way I started managing. There's a real danger when you're very successful that you get into this almost cult of invincibility, and that you start to believe that you are God's gift to humanity and all these amazing things you can do. And the interesting bit of that, and of course we've spoken about this, it's actually those periods of tension or pressure, or when things are going wrong, which you actually get the most learning out of.
Do you think, if we look at business as a system, right, the phenomena of business in society, you see a lot of the sort of egocentricity that you describe. So do you think business attracts and promotes that kind of person, or is it the system itself?
I think it's both, In fact, I was talking to Jeff Cooper, who recruited me into Dunelm. He said to me once, he said, "John, the reason I want to hire you is you've been fired." And I said, "Why is that important?" He said, "Well, I've been fired twice." And he then told his story about what had happened, etc. And he said that those moments are very important because they actually reset you. Whereas continued success, you basically just you become uncritical of your own behaviour.
And have you noticed over your years in retail, particularly, that this sort of awakening in business, of realising that there is this interior within leaders? I mean, has it changed over the years, or are most leaders still very it-focused, externally focused, doing task? Is there enough inner reflection?
Very occasionally you do meet people who've got that inner humility, etc., and they're in a very different place on leadership than I would say general run-of-the-mill. And I think people are slowly learning that humility, which is almost a manifestation of actually that inward looking and actually making sure that you are right as a person, is a very important thing.
Right. There's also the interpersonal dimension, right? The criticality of the we space, as we might say.
Yeah.
So what's been your experience, your learning, and how you've developed in the interpersonal dimension?
The reason I actually went to run a business was that I actually had worked out that actually the power of the team, or the power of relationships, the power of culture, was actually one of the most critical things in the business. But what I really wanted to do, though, was to show, even in a fairly difficult turnaround situation, that if you actually got the culture right and if you got the senior leadership right, that it would work really well.
You must enjoy being a chief executive so much more now that you're aware of the I and the we so much more than earlier on in your career.
I mean, it is the most powerful thing. Positive feedback you get from the organisation when you actually fix the culture and everything else is just fantastic. I mean, I'm not interested in power, money or status. I'm much more interested in the impact I can have through relationships in work and what that means for then how the organisation performs than anything you could give me in terms of recognition.
As the world becomes more complicated, it's kind of difficult for one person, or for us to expect one person to get their head around the level of complexity in the market and all the different dimensions of any large-scale business. So it sort of just makes common sense that we've got to do it collectively.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think modern business now is much more complicated and sophisticated because technology has just made it much more possible to do things which you just 20 years ago, even 30 years you couldn't have done. I just don't think you can actually manage in the old-fashioned mechanistic command and control tell. I mean, even when I'm talking to my stores where you're talking to people who are on hourly pay, etc., we spend a lot of time trying to actually make that environment a great place to work so that people actually really enjoy coming to work in Dunelm. I mean, for me, it's a really critical part of making that a successful business. So it's not just something for the executive team, it's for the whole company.
So the criticality of relationships, not only within the business, but with suppliers, absolutely crucial to sustain success.
Yes, I mean, it's just how it has to be. And there are so many examples of companies which have lost sight of their role within society, and as a consequence, eventually it's gone wrong on them.
So I think when businesses realise this sort of multi-dimension of our lives, there is a doing world, an interior world of I, and a relationship world of we. When businesses start to wake up to the I, we, it dimensionality within their own business, but also within society, then we can really unlock some great
and
potential.
I saw that actually, fun enough, with Apple. I think that's a very good company and who really does strive to do that. And it was very interesting the way in which they thought about their impact on society in a general sense. And that's a very large company. And I think for all of us running businesses, that has to be the right way to behave. Because in the end, that's the imprint which you leave on the world.
Well, it's so delightful to talk to you, to find a leader who understands the multiple dimensions that exist within themselves, within their team, within their organisation, and the importance of that in society.
Well, I'd only say I'm still working on it, Alan. That's the thing, because it's not a finished thing. I mean, I would still feel that for all of this sort of these dimensions, I'm still learning and still working on how to put it together.
Right. Thank you very much for your time, John.
Thank you.